Gentlemen, it is a pleasure to call this meeting of the Banking, Trade and Commerce Committee to order. This afternoon, we are going to continue the 5-year parliamentary review of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. This is our 10th meeting on the subject. Over the last month, the committee has focused its efforts on hearing from a number of so-called regime partners involved in the implementation and administration of this legislation. And as committee members know, over the course of our hearings, a number of references have been made to a 10-year review of the Act conducted for the Department of Finance by Capra International, Inc. We are pleased today to welcome the authors of that report. Representing Capra International, we welcome Gunter Rojo, President, Michelle Larendeau, Senior Evaluator, Rick Reynolds, Evaluator, Eric Cully, Evaluator, Waldo Rojo, Evaluator, and also joining us by video conference from Orlando, Florida, of which we're envious, is Dr. Ralph Kellett, Chief Evaluation Practice. Now, colleagues, before we begin, as you are aware, the business of the Senate continues. We have permission to proceed with our meeting, but should the bells ring for a vote, we will suspend the meeting so that we can return to the chamber to fulfill our duty and beg your indulgence. Mr. Rojo, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, we thank you very much for having received us actually 1 week later than was originally planned, so that our colleague, Dr. Ralph Kellett, could join us, who played a very important role as methodologist and also as chief writer of the report. And we are very happy that we see him present with us in a warmer climate, although we're not complaining of what we have in Ottawa at the moment. It is my great pleasure to summarize for you some of the key aspects of the 10-year review that we were privileged to undertake. And I wish to assure you that everything that we say this afternoon, by the very nature of the beast, must be limited to our evaluation. There are many other subjects of interest out there that belong to the departments, and we have no jurisdiction. So all that we bring to you is the very best we can in form of an overview of what actually happened in the evaluation. And then at the end, we welcome questions, and to the best of our ability, we will respond to whatever may be necessary for you to further this important cause. Now, as you are aware, the regime establishment, meaning the regime of the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing activities, was a horizontal initiative involving both funded partners and non-funded partners. And I think this is very important to recognize that difference. When you're a funded partner, you have a stronger commitment than when you are a non-funded partner. Nevertheless, to our great satisfaction, we found that both the funded partners and the non-funded partners have gone out of their way to contribute to the evaluation activity, and we're very grateful for that and very pleased. Now, the funded partners were the Department of Finance, Department of Justice, Public Prosecution Service of Canada, Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre, the Canada Border Services Agency, Canada Revenue Agency, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. The non-funded partners were Public Safety Canada, Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and the Department of Foreign Affairs. So, as you can imagine, working in an evaluation with such a large group requires a great deal of effort in terms of communication to both draw out necessary information and also to verify the information with the partners. And as I indicated before, we're absolutely delighted with the effort of both the funded and the unfunded partners in contributing to the information that we needed to carry out this work. Now, by implication, the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime comprises the activities that are inherent in the mandates of the partners, funded partners, non-funded partners, but beyond them, contributing provincial, regional, municipal bodies, regulatory bodies, law enforcement bodies, and entities obliged to report financial information under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act and its regulations. But in addition, the review also involved other legislation: the Criminal Code, Customs Act, Charities Registration or Security Information Act, Income Tax Act, and for all I know, there may have been others. But the list of legislated and related contacts did not end there, because this regime has important international linkages, particularly under the Financial Action Task Force on Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing. And the regime, while linking into all of these Canadian interests, also linked deeply into the international community where the same concerns are shared and where Canada is an important partner. Now, when it comes to the evaluation, what does an evaluation do? What are its constraints? And I must say that fortunately for us, the Treasury Board of Canada, which issued in 2009 its new policy on evaluation, the standard on the evaluation function for the Canadian government, the directive on the evaluation function, has provided us with the framework within which we had to undertake the evaluation. In other words, what we did was not a few shots into the dark. We followed the criteria and guidelines provided by the Treasury Board of Canada in structuring the evaluation, in going after data in an organized fashion. And what we ended up with in the final report was really a fuller image of that federal structure and framework. Now, what is that framework? The Treasury Board of Canada, in its evaluation policy, said that all evaluations that relate to federal government operations must address two core issues: relevance and performance. And within these two core issues, other issues. And so what are they? Under the relevance component, the first issue is to address the need for the regime. Is that still needed? And the government has an obvious interest in not financing anything that is no longer needed. So it was our job in the evaluation to demonstrate that there's a continuing need for this activity. Another issue that concerns the government is when you address a program like that in an evaluation, is it aligned with government priorities? And you bet it is. we found that as we proceeded through the evaluation, what could be more central to ensuring the financial security of the country than not letting others run wild with our financial system? The third issue to be addressed under the Treasury Board guidelines in the category of relevance concerns its alignment with federal roles and responsibilities. Again, it was not difficult in the evaluation to demonstrate that this is indeed a federal responsibility in collaboration with provincial and municipal and private sector and international partners. When it comes to the second issue on evaluation, the second core issue, that is, performance, it is as characterized by two additional issues that account for performance. One is the question of effectiveness. Did the regime achieve expected outcomes? And this included, among other things, the implementation and to some extent the design of the regime, followed by the last issue in the Treasury Board structure, which focused on questions of efficiency and economy. And this was the structure in which we were asked to undertake the evaluation. Now, how did we go about it? When we were confronted with this major task, which we undertook very happily, we used a number of so-called lines of evidence or data collection methods. The first one referred to secondary research, which is referred to as a document and file review. In other words, we looked at everything that was relevant that we could get our hands on. And believe it or not, just to give you a sense of the dimension of the magnitude, this involved 166 documents. Now, in Senate operations, I'm sure you're familiar with numbers like that, and I often wonder how you cope with the documents that are being put upon you. We had 166. Then there was a database review and analysis. It involved the collection of performance data from the regime partners. And as I indicated, there were a lot of them. The provision of budget information from the Department of Finance. The conduct of a financial expenditure survey among regime partners. Then there were interviews about regime operations. And the interviews, as you can imagine, are directed to the key people who are responsible for particular aspects of the regime. We interviewed 34 of these. Then there were focus groups, which bring together still more witnesses, so to speak, as to what happened. And here we had 6 in the public sector, 4 in the private sector. Then there were case studies on regime operations, and we did 13 of them. Then there was an online survey, and in it we gathered 256 responses from a great variety of people who were not reached in the interviews, focus groups, case studies, and so forth. In other words, we tried to achieve as good a penetration of the universe that should contribute to the evaluation as was possible in the context of time and the available budget. And I must say at this point, all of these activities are not obligatory. We invite people to participate in interviews. We invite people to participate in focus groups. We invite them to respond to a survey. But one of the cardinal rules that appears on the first page, this is voluntary. where we don't have forced responses, and so the responses that we did get are the ones that people happily contributed to the exercise. Now, when it was all said and done, what did we conclude in this exercise? And first of all, in regards to the first issue of relevance, we concluded that such an initiative is indeed needed to combat the threat from money laundering and terrorist financing, which has not diminished since the regime was implemented in 2000. We also concluded, in terms of relevance, that the regime's operation supports the government priorities related to justice, to the financial systems, to national security and privacy, and the regime is an appropriate response to the global threat of money laundering and terrorist financing. In particular, the legislative and regulatory framework was modified in accordance with evolving need. The regime is a horizontal initiative, and it's needed for that reason, bringing federal, provincial, regional, municipal entities together to promote joint action. And the regime is also a government priority because its legislative, regulatory, structural, organizational, and operational activities helped Canada to respond to 36 of the FATF 40+9 recommendations. That's a convoluted name, but we all know to what it refers. Then it is a government priority because the regime partners and stakeholders at all levels consider the regime to be relevant to counter the money laundering and terrorist financing threat. Now, what about the last aspect of relevance? The regime objective is completely aligned with the mandates of the regime partners. Although the mandates of all partners, except for FinTrack, are broader than the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing aspects. Now, what about the conclusions that we found in regards to performance? Now, performance, as I indicated earlier, is the second core issue that all evaluations under the Treasury Board criteria must address. And here we found that the regime has made progress in achieving the expected outcomes. And the word progress is a very important one in Treasury Board terminology. They don't expect that just because a program has been launched and has been in operation, that we've already reached the promised land. But we're making progress in getting there, and that's what is expected of the regime partners. And we have verified in the evaluation that indeed progress is being made. Now, Canada is compliant with 36 of the 40+9 FATF recommendations on anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing. There's progress in implementing the very act that is now under review and its regulations. It meets anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist funding responsibilities, and that's a very important detail, without violating privacy and rights and freedoms provisions. And that, I think, to Canada's honor, it's got to be one of the key features of an activity like that. Then, continuing on our conclusions about performance, the regime is facilitating and monitoring compliance. There is intelligence gathering and analysis. There is investigation, adjudication, and sanctioning. And of course, there's regime implementation. And I think one of the conclusions that appear to us in this is that the regime indeed created a hostile environment to anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. And this is one of these things that cannot be quantified in ever so many terms. But by creating a hostile environment, the regime has made it a lot tougher for criminals to peddle their wares, to bring in money. They have to fight a lot harder being criminals. And in our conclusion about this activity, we consider that's a very major achievement. If we make it tough for them, then less money will be laundered, less terrorist financing will occur. If you ask us the question by how much, we can't tell you. But we know the environment is a lot rougher, and I'm glad I'm not one of them. It'd be a hard time to do my job. What about conclusions about efficiency? Now, while the efficiency has improved since 2008, additional gains in efficiency are unlikely without adjustments to regime funding. We try to look at this as much as we can as evaluators. And it became apparent that when you have both funded entities and unfunded entities, then they have to see how they can do what has been assigned to them and how they can best do their jobs. And for us, we're outsiders peeking in. And we discovered that in many cases, they said, look, we've got to do this on a risk assessment basis. Where is the greatest risk? Where can we put most of our dollars and most of our effort? And that's a reasonable approach, also recommended by the Treasury Board. They said, you can't do everything. You can't count every last penny. You can't go after every last individual. But if you can focus on what is obviously the greatest risk, that's where you should start, and then do as much more as you're able to do within the confines of your work. And this is actually what is behind this conclusion. We said that in our opinion, the improvement of efficiency has been very significant since 2008. If we're still going after more, we felt that the people who have to deliver it won't be able to do it without more funding. And you've already heard from them, and they will probably have told you that story, that how much they're able to do and how much they might not be able to do, and where some of the trade-offs are. Now, the last aspect, concerning the fifth issue in the Treasury Board structure, is the question whether the regime is economical. And our conclusion is that yes, it is, because the regime activities fit within the broader mandate of the regime partners. So it is not something that is freestanding. And when you have something that is freestanding, it makes it expensive. But here you have something that fits into the broader structures. And there's some trade-offs. There's some infrastructure that you can depend on, that you can utilize in order to deliver this. So the conclusion is, yes, the regime activities fit within the broader mandate of the regime partners. And then there is also the economic conclusion in the sense that other government programs are mandated to fund the AML/ATF activities in part. In other words, the government has said, look, RCMP, you're getting this bag of gold to do your work. We want you to spend some of it in this area. Look, DFATE, you have that much money. There are certain things on the international scene that we want you to cover from within that bag of gold. And so when it comes to the economy of this regime, our conclusion was that the combination of funding for funded partners and drawing on other unfunded partners was indeed evidence that it is an economical way to deal with this issue. Now, in conclusion, I would like us to just spend a moment on what we had offered as recommendations. Well, the first recommendation to us seemed entirely obvious, but we stated it because it needed to be said. Indeed, the regime should continue. I would not want to live in a Canada without it. Then we have another recommendation, that the Department of Finance should lead an interdepartmental working group with the regime partners to determine future steps and examine key issues. And we put down the issues, and I'll spell them out in a moment. We put this in here because in an evaluation, we see both the past and we're also looking ahead. And in an evaluation, we can't spell out the details of what lies ahead. But we found and we believed that this is the prerogative of the regime partners to discuss, and hence the suggestion that finance should lead an interdepartmental working group. Now, what should they address? They should look at regime-related legislation and regulations to remove any barriers to effective and efficient regime operations. And as you can imagine, there are certain barriers that are inherent in the legislation or regulations of some of the regime partners. They say, you can't release this bit of information. You are the custodian. And so if we want them to work together, there are some of these barriers, and they may have to continue. But then the question is, can we optimize the way these various requirements fit together? Then we found that the interdepartmental working group should address concerns raised by reporting entities regarding compliance with the very act that is now under review. Inconsistencies in the regime performance data and statistics. Now, this is a difficult job because each department, each agency, each entity has set up its own reporting requirements and statistics to meet its own needs. And sometimes when you're dealing with a horizontal initiative such as this, it's very difficult to harmonize all of this. And yet the suggestion was that an interdepartmental working group look at this problem. And then whether they should also look at whether updates are required to the regime's management and accountability framework and the logic model, which would be a result of their deliberations about the previous factors. And then a final recommendation actually came out of one of the questions that was given to us, but which obviously in an evaluation of this type was beyond our mandate. And the question was, what does the Canadian public think of this regime? We don't know. And the only way that this can be done is if if you or finance would want it done, is that you consider conducting a public opinion survey to determine the level of public awareness of the money laundering and terrorist financing threat, and of the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing actions of the regime. And Mr. Chairman, my last 2 words are thank you.
Well, I'll start by saying thank you for your opening remarks. We're delighted to have you here. Before we move to questions on your evaluation, might I ask you, perhaps it would be of great help to the committee, it certainly would be to myself, if you could give us some of the background and scope of Capra International?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is no subject on earth that I would rather address than this one. Capra International is a small company, but it has a large network of very valued collaborators. Our reach is literally worldwide. We have worked in our largest evaluation, which gives you a bit of a yardstick, with a horizontal initiative involving 6 large international agencies, one directly related to what you're doing, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, UNDP, UNCTAD, and the International Trade Center, plus 17 donor countries, of which Canada was one, represented by DFAID, plus 19 least developed countries, mostly in Africa, 1 in the Americas, which was Haiti, and 4 in Asia. That was our largest project. And needless to say, the one of which we're probably the most proud. But the second one that ranks not so much in the same spread is the very one that we're presenting here, of which we're extremely proud, and we're thankful to the people with whom we have worked. Currently, we're doing evaluation work in Nigeria for UNICEF. We're doing more evaluation work for the Inter-American Development Bank in Suriname. We have just launched a new project for CEDA, which involves Uganda, Nicaragua, and Peru, and our associate arrived in Uganda on the weekend. We are also doing projects for the Ministry of Justice. We have just concluded one for Indian and Northern Affairs. This gives you a little bit of a feel. It's a big spread for a small company, and that's what we're proud of.
Well, I thank you very much for that background. Now we might move to some questions on the report. In your report, you talk about the regime has made progress in achieving the outcomes, and if I quote from your report directly, you say, improving domestically the regime's level of liaison, cooperation, and information sharing, end of quote. And it's certainly encouraging for us to hear that the regime as a horizontal initiative is reflecting the increased cooperation between governments. On the other hand, I personally was surprised that your report makes no recommendations, nor in fact makes any reference to the whole area of communication, cooperation, and guidance between FINTRAC and the reporting entities. And we had quotes directly from Ms. Susanna Johnson that talked about how difficult it was because the reporting entities found that they had very limited guidance. We had testimony from Mr. Randall of the Canadian Bankers Association, who talked about that it would be very helpful if there was some sharing of information between financial institutions and FINTRAC. That would be of great help to them. So it appears that there might be a major opportunity to improve the effectiveness of the regime by providing better guidance and increasing the sharing of information between FinTrack and the reporting entities, and I'd just be interested in your reaction to those comments.
Well, I will offer a brief comment, but then I would like to bring in my very valued associate, Dr. Ralph Kellett, whom you are seeing here on the scene, to contribute a little more. While this had not been singled out as such, it is a very part of the first recommendation that regime-related legislation and regulations be looked at to remove barriers to effective and efficient regime operations. We viewed this very point that you raised as part of it, but our concern was that the complexities of legislative and regulatory barriers that may prevent better communication needs to be looked at by the partners to see to what extent we can go beyond this. And at this point, I would like to end my comment and ask my colleague, Dr. Ralph Kellett, to offer more information if he wishes to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think your question focuses largely on the communication between FinTrack and the providers of the information, the various reporting entities. I guess the intermediary between that are the various regulators that FinTrack works with first. OSFI is one of them, but there are 18 regulators that they have established memoranda of understanding, MOUs, with. Prior to the 2005-2006 fiscal year, they didn't have all those MOUs in place. So when we said progress, we're talking about the things that they have done to improve the communication between FinTrack and their clientele, both the organizational ones and then the reporting entities. We did hear both in the focus groups with the 4 private sector focus groups, which involve the reporting entities, as well as from the surveys, that the picture is still not as good as they'd like it. They did say if you look at what's deficient in terms of the communication, it certainly is the lack of understanding, even of some of the large banks, for example, CIBC, Bank of Montreal, and the others, about what the shifting in reporting requirements and what's really expected about risk analysis. They feel it's a one-way. They felt it was a one-way communication. They were providing information and rarely getting much back. Now, the constraint there, of course, is FinTrack's mandate and its requirements under the privacy legislation not to communicate a great deal back. The example of one of the larger financial organizations gave was that they provided information over a number of years and yet never really knew what happened when they flagged a particular suspicious transaction, and they knew that something happened in the way of a prosecution or investigation, but they weren't privy, of course, to any of the outcomes until perhaps if they saw it somewhere in the news that somebody was convicted of a money laundering offense. So I think that's where some of the concerns come from. They talked about a need for more education and information specific to their responsibilities in reporting. And I think those are valid comments. Not as much has been done by FinTrack or the other partners in terms of educating and encouraging and providing information down the stream as has been in terms of providing information about how they need to report up the stream. Does that answer your question?
Very much so, and I thank you for that answer. I'm going to turn now to my speakers list, and I have first Senator Ringuette, who will be followed by Senator Malte.
Thank you, Chair, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. And before I lead on to my questions, I have a point of privilege that I want to raise with the Chair, and that is the fact that the Senate is sitting in committee of the whole at the same time as standing committee of the Senate, like ours, is entertaining witnesses in regards to the current study of FinTrack. As much as I want to be a full participant in the different discussions that duties have been directed toward me, i.e. being a member of this committee. I also value my privilege as being a full participant in the Senate deliberation. And therefore, I certainly do not agree that Committee of the Whole of the Senate and Standing Committee of the Senate occur at the same time. Point noted. Thank you, gentlemen. When did you do this review that you were requested by Treasury Board?
We started on the 1st of March 2010 and concluded sometime in November with minor tinkering a few days into December. But I think it was largely completed in November 2010.
Thank you. We've, for many committee meetings, we've been reviewing the current legislation and the proposal from the Department of Justice and FinTrack. I was kind of worried that the taxpayer have been spending over the last 10 years almost $1 billion, and the only seeable result was one case of money laundering in BC that resulted in a 6 months prison sentence. So in regards to efficiency, I certainly was questioning, is this the best way that we can prevent, A, and 2, identify, and 3, prosecute money laundering and those entities that operate in Canada. So I'd like to have your comments on my comments.
Well, as I indicated at the outset, in an evaluation, we tried to get at data that address the prescribed issues, of which efficiency is one. However, having said that, you're dealing with efficiencies involving many horizontal partners within their mandated roles. And if the question is whether we could have had a bigger bang for the buck, which I think you're going to, I'm not sure whether that is within the range of the mandate that we were given. However, having said that, I would again like to ask 2 of our associates to add to that, Dr. Kallett and also Eric Cully, perhaps in that order.
Thank you, Gunther. There are 2 issues, there are 2 responses I could make that point to your question. The first is that if there's a table early on in the report describing the program, the financial allocation model of the program to the various funded partners over the last, since 2005-06. We looked at the most recent 5-year period during the evaluation. And in the financial analysis, what we found, of course, was that the funding directly for under PCML TFA and for the regime, the federal direct funding accounts for about 74% of what's actually expended. So about a quarter of the expenditures needed to cover all of the activities. I know FinTrack is fully funded, but the other departments are, for example, the RCMP under proceeds of crime, and then within that, the money laundering organization. So you have about a quarter of the activities being undertaken within current mandate of the departments. In and of itself, that speaks to an economy, as was mentioned in the opening remarks by Mr. Rojo. So I think that's important to note in terms of the buck, how much is being spent. In terms of the bang, there is a real issue that you've highlighted here, and that is, how do you measure success? Of course, the ultimate outcome, as shown in their logic model that underpins the whole program, the whole regime, not just the act, but the whole of the regime, is that there would be two things. Well, primarily deterrence of money laundering and terrorist financing activity. It wasn't the ultimate goal was not to prosecute or lock people up. It is, of course, to deter. So if you prevent money laundering from occurring, that's presumed to be a more desirable outcome according to the model, the logic model that we work from, than actually apprehending people and convicting them and locking them up. So the part of that whole issue about conviction rate is something that the FATF has been very critical of Canada, particularly from the US, because each country measures its conviction rate in different ways. They have different data sets. As we mentioned in our recommendation, one of the recommendations is that something be looked at in terms of how the data, the Statistics Canada crime data and so on, is rolled up to look at money laundering and terrorist financing. We had very little success in trying to bring together data that others had not been successful in bringing together to come up with even an idea of what is a conviction rate. So what the outcome is in terms of the bang is also in doubt, because we really don't know. For example, when people get apprehended under proceeds of crime, part of that is money laundering. Another part of it may be the selling of drugs, for example, or theft, or the use of intimidation with the use of bank machines. I mean, so people are prosecuted under a lot of other crimes, the predicate offenses, and not necessarily just for money laundering. So we had real difficulty, we must acknowledge, in trying to measure that ultimate outcome. In fact, we say in the report that we can really only measure the intermediate or immediate outcomes, and that have to infer from that the deterrence is occurring. Just the fact that I think that's, and Mr. Cully would have more remarks about the data and the difficulty of verifying what that bang is.
Yes, we had a lot of difficulty with the statistics, and there's one linkage between charges and charges being laid and the convictions obtained, because first of all, the data with the RCMP wasn't matched with the data from the PPSC, and many of these cases, when they start from an initial investigation all the way through to a trial, takes years. So what the data that we saw coming out of PPSC was in the main related to charges and investigations that took place 3 or 4 years before. And so the common database for that relationship doesn't exist. And that's one of the matters that we brought forward in our recommendations. The other part of it is also key, is that we weren't able to, with the RCMP data, to tie together the impact of ML activities with the predicate offenses themselves. So we couldn't determine from the data whether the interceptions that were being made, the results of the investigations what effect those incidents had on being able to catch the criminal, not for ML, but for the crimes themselves, whether it was drug offenses or whether it was tax evasion or whether it was terrorist activities. There's no linkage in the data. So we're in a situation where we have to sort of guess, and we didn't guess because we weren't able to follow that trail. But getting back to the bigger bang for the buck, the bigger bang relates to what is it you're trying to do? Is it you're trying to create a hostile environment to protect our banking system? Are we trying to catch the terrorists? And we're using the money laundering activity to try to trace, to try to track. It's not the money laundering so much that is the bang. It's whether, in fact, you can catch the criminals on the bigger matter, and to create a hostile environment for money laundering so that we can maintain the integrity of our financial system. So in order to answer that bang for the buck, you have to figure out, well, what is it that you're trying to do?
Thank you. Dr. Pellet, you specifically, and I can understand, we need a system to act as at least a deterrent. That, okay. My question is this the system that seems to be doing the job? That's our mandate at looking at reviewing the legislation and the regime. You indicated 74% of the fund needed is with FinTrack, and you kind of hinted that maybe more attention and more funding should be given to a particular unit within the RCMP to look into money laundering. That could provide more bang for the buck. Am I reading your comments correctly?
Yes, you are. In fact, in the report, I wouldn't say it that directly, but in the report we noted that FinTrack is the only partner that's fully funded for, directly from the funds going through PCML, TFA. All of the others are providing, because it's part of their mandate, totally or in part, their own resources to make up the difference. The RCMP is in a particularly difficult situation there because they have an integrated proceeds of crime, IPOC operation, which in fact looks more broadly. And naturally, when they're doing an investigation, if disclosures come from FinTrack, valid disclosures that say this is something that needs to be investigated for money laundering. If they're already involved in an investigation to do with those particular individuals or organizations, then this is that great information that helps them build into the investigation, and frequently, as you could see from the data we reported, leads to some kind of prosecution or freezing of funds or recovery of money. But when they receive the disclosures that are not related, they don't have the resources to go and launch something outside of what they're already looking at. So that's because they're not fully funded under ML or under the other organization under the TF activity. Mm-hmm. It's not that
one last
FinTrack
question.
Needs to be cut. Yeah.
Sorry. One last question. In the Department of Justice and FinTrack are suggesting that the $10,000 standard to report be lowered to $1, therefore increasing exponentially the amount of data. Mind you that the $10,000 standard was put in place 10 years ago and at the 10-year-ago value for $10,000. So I'd like to have your comments about that request to reduce to $1 all the transaction needed to be reported.
I think the only way we can answer that from the evaluation perspective is based on the data that we gathered for the evaluation. We weren't specifically mandated to look at any of the particular changes that might be made to the Act itself. We looked at those that were causing inefficiencies as opposed to those that were efficient. That one, the level of the threshold dollar figure wasn't one of the things that was causing an inefficiency. One of the inefficiencies, in fact, was the number of valid disclosures being made by FinTrack for investigation that couldn't be followed up because of a lack of resources, and I might also add the skilled staff to pursue those particular that information. The information, by the way, one of the progress areas is that the information from FinTrack has become more fulsome since 2008. And we mentioned that as one of the improvements in efficiency. When they got the information, they could do more with it and follow the thread to, if you would, find the bad guys and then follow the money and do something about it. Mm-hmm. To say that you need more information coming up the pipe from the banks and so on, I think the entities that report would have to comment whether this would cause them more grief than they currently, because all of their activities, of course, are not funded. They're doing this from their own operations. Whether that would cause them more grief or not, and with their customers, that's one issue. The other is whether it would actually end up leading to more information and more tracking would provide more bang down the line with prosecutions. As I said, one of the inefficiencies was not a lack of the number of proactive disclosures. So lowering the threshold gives more information, more analysis. That may be helpful. You'd have to find out from FinTrack how much that would contribute to their sharpening or making more fulsome their information, because they do link individual cases. So we didn't speak to that, though, only the fact that it wasn't at the moment we did the study an inefficiency, the fact that the threshold was too high.
Thank you, Senator Ringette. Senator Malte to be followed by Senator Day.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. I will allow you to put on your earpieces if you wish to hear in translation. I am Ghislain Maltais. I'm a senator from Quebec. You know that money laundering is of great concern to Canadians and financial institutions in particular, the government as well. There are lots of people who work in anti-money laundering activities. This is not a Canadian phenomenon. It's something at the international level. We've heard a great deal of testimony, and I think the chair can confirm this. But I'd like to deal more specifically with a point that is raised in your brief, namely life insurance. Life insurance, insurance companies are far more restrictive because of the nature of their activities, and having had an insurance business before going into politics, I'm aware of this, and I know that Canadian life insurance companies and other life insurance companies, American and British ones, were very restrictive with respect to the quality of the client. How is it possible to infiltrate through money laundering insurance companies, Canadian insurance companies? It strikes me as rather paradoxical, because other than buying an annuity, the insurance companies would not accept large sums of money for an annuity. They might accept several $1,000s a month, but in the case of life insurance, the fact remains that there is an important clause, that is the insurable interest, and in the case of terrorism, I do not see where this comes into play. I don't know if anyone could give me information to enlighten me on this point, because it seems to me improbable, and I'd like to know what type of experience you have seen of infiltration of insurance companies through money laundering. Unfortunately, I'm unable to tell you to what extent this particular aspect was dealt with. However, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Kellett, to tell us about his experience relating to life insurance and the place that it occupies when it comes to money laundering. I don't know whether Dr. Kellett did have a chance to hear the question, and if not, I'd like to repeat it for him.
Mr. Rick Reynolds was our AML ATF expert in the evaluation, but I would be, as a methodologist, I would say, first of all, that we were looking at the larger issues, not drilling down into we received as part of the program profile that we describe in our report, what are the entities that are currently covered by the PCML TFA, and we just simply list them. We don't say why they're there or because that wasn't our mandate. And when there was some issues around should coverage, had been moved since 2008 to try to expand coverage in other areas, and there was some disagreement among the partners, the horizontal partners, about whether that should be done or not. In our conclusions, we didn't see, again, we didn't ask about specific entities that would be covered or not covered, nor how money laundering actually occurs within. For example, you mentioned life insurance companies. We might look at casinos were also covered and say, how does it occur there? It may be a little more obvious. And the other organizations that are mentioned. So this wasn't really an area where we delved into it. You'd really need to address that to the experts from finance, or particularly the FinTrack, who have sort of researched all of that data. But maybe Mr. Reynolds might have a comment that was sort of, I could say, was outside our methodological purview.
Thank you very much. In respect to that, of course, as Dr. Kellett said, that wasn't part of our mandate to look at. However, within the FATF recommendations, insurance companies are identified as one of the risk areas that needs to be covered. But from my past life in dealing with anti-money laundering and terrorist financing matters, I know that it's one of the mechanisms that can be used. The insurance companies, not so much annuities, but for example, large policies, and especially large down payments on policies, bearing in mind that a similar situation exists for casinos. For example, going in and doing minimal gambling, cashing out your chips, and then receiving a check back from the casino. What you're getting back is something that appears to be legitimate, or could be presented as legitimate. The same thing exists with the insurance companies. So you put down and purchase a large policy, and then cancel the policy. And the policy, the money would be returned by check with the insurance company's name on it, which would then lend an air of legitimacy to it. And it's a number of mechanisms, it's not a single mechanism, that money laundering attempts to apply to disguise the source of the fund, but that would be one of them. Mm-hmm. And it would have to be a case, as Dr. Kellett said, to go back to FinTrack and the RCMP or the other agencies to get the actual cases that they're seeing lately.
Monsieur Reynolds, si vous permettez, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Reynolds, if I may ask a last question. Mr. Reynolds, I'd like to know whether you are aware of the fact that in capitalist countries there is an international association of insurance companies that provide services dealing specifically with money laundering as an international phenomenon.
With the insurance companies. I don't know if within that association there are specific individuals, I believe there is, that are responsible, similar to within the CBA, within the Canadian Bankers Association, that specialize in dealing with money laundering issues.
Okay. Est-ce que la Capra a des...
Can you tell me whether Capra has already seen any particular cases of money laundering in insurance companies? Has there ever been any information on this? No? Thank you.
Senator Day, to be followed by Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here and giving us the overview. Mr. Rakow, I made a note when you were giving your presentation, and then Mr. Kellett has referred to the same issue with respect to funded partners and non-funded partners, and I think it would be helpful to clarify the record on just why that has come up a couple of times, because I think I made the note that the RCMP was funded, and then I heard that
No.
they're not funded.
No, they're not funded.
So, okay, so I'll put them down under not funded. Surely, any of these organizations are funded by the public purse and by appropriations, and so whether you're very specifically have a line item that says for the work under proceeds of crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing, or it's just under the general operation revenue, does that make a big difference?
I think I can clarify this.
Thank you.
There's actually some funding to the RCMP for 43 positions. But the non-funded partners, just to reiterate these once more, Public Safety Canada, Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and then the Department of Foreign Affairs. They're
Yes.
the non-funded ones. Now, the question then boils down to this. Within the extent of funding that is available, can they in fact do what is expected of them? And this is where questions of risk are uppermost, to go after the highest risk. We cannot answer, at least I am not aware of it, unless one of my associates is, to what extent the 43 positions that have been mentioned are in fact adequate to do what is expected of them. I don't know whether Dr. Kellett or anybody else has some more detail on that.
Dr. Kellett, where do the funds come from? Is this all public appropriation funds, or where are the funds coming from that you're making this distinction?
Yes, in the case for, you cited the case of the RCMP and their 43 full-time equivalents that are in the proceeds of crime unit that are intended to be dedicated to money laundering. Most of those are throughout the country in the regions. In the evaluation, of course, we interviewed and did surveys and had focus groups involving the RCMP as well as the other partners, mostly the funded partners. The funding, that being funded partner, means that they get a specific block of money under the implementation of the PCML TFA. So it is a lump sum of money or an allocation within the budgetary system that goes to Department of Finance. They in turn have allocated based on their initial submission to each of the funded partners. In the case, and as we mentioned, except for FinTrack, where 100% of their operation is funded from that monies, the other departments all have to, in order to achieve what they can under their mandate, have had to put in more in order to get to where they are now, and that may not be in their view where they'd like to be. And the RCMP is one example of that, where we observed it as an inefficiency in the system. That is, they were receiving disclosures, good disclosures from FinTrack, for which they couldn't do anything with. They weren't able to receive for the last 3 years. They weren't able to carry on any investigations for those new disclosures because they didn't have the resources. That is an inefficiency, if you would. FinTrack is pumping it out. The investigative arm can't do anything with it because their allocation under the, as they say, under the Act is not enough. Yes, they're totally publicly funded. The rest is in their, what they call the A base, their allocation for other parts of their operation.
Yeah, they're operating. Yeah, thank you. I think that that clarifies your concerns, and I see what you're looking for. The second question relates to your presentation again, Mr. Rakow, where you talked about you were talking about the efficiency and the effectiveness, your evaluation and of the regime of the legislation, And you talked about, I made a note here of the hostile environment has been created, and you wouldn't want to be trying to get around that hostile environment. But then I read our briefing note that suggests that the RCMP estimates in 2011 between $5 billion and $15 billion annually laundered in Canada. So is that a hostile enough environment, or are we prepared to accept the $15 billion being laundered each year as being the norm, and it might be $50 billion if we didn't have the regime?
Again, I think personally I will have to defer to some of my associates who may have the actual numbers. My understanding is if this hostile environment that has been created had not been created, there would be a lot more, but I cannot tell you to what extent. The other question is how much more could actually have been prevented
Exactly.
if more resources had been pumped into it.
Yes.
Now, in part, as I indicated, we're sort of approaching the evaluation from the perspective of progress. And in having gone over the numbers over the years, it became apparent that indeed there has been progress. Enough progress, well, that's a judgment call. How much more we can do before diminishing returns set in is also a judgment call. But I would again like to invite either Dr. Kellett or Mr. Cully or others who could shed greater light on this question, which is important.
Could I take a first crack at that?
Please do.
If you like. In our background research for the study, we were asked to look at some of the FATF's they call mutual evaluation reports, the MERs, done on Canada and other countries, and meticulously sort of go through where were our deficiencies and where were our strengths and so on. And one of the issues that has been with FATF, and Rick Reynolds can comment on this as well, is that the estimates of what is the actual depth of the crime. How much money is being laundered? How much money do terrorists obtain to finance their operations? This is really, as the RCMP mentioned, somewhere between 5 and 15 billion. That's quite a range in terms of percentages. I think the answer is simply that no one really knows when they've gotten away with it. No one really knows. You can only estimate based on what the actual legitimate transactions and then the amount of size of the economy, and estimate that there's a lot of not being accounted for. I think that's the issue there. And in fact, as Mr. Rowe mentioned, we're not mandated to say, we're only to look, has there been progress in terms of some of the indicators in the shorter term of success. For example, the amount of seizures made by CBSA, the dollar value of the seizures, the number of seizures, and has that improved? And it had improved considerably for a few years, and then around 2009-10 looked to be sort of plateauing. And much same with the number of investigations and the amount of money frozen by the RCMP that they considered to be that which was resulting from money laundering. So we did see signs of increased seizures and freezing of funds and so on in there. This is displayed in some of the graphs in the report. But with that, how much dent does that make? We really can't say. But if you've made any dent, I presume it means that there is an environment that is not welcoming or friendly to money launderers, that Canada is playing its part internationally and making that publicly known, that they're trying to do something about e-transfers, trying to do something about cash cards, ATMs, and so on. So I think that, but maybe Mr. Reynolds or Mr. Cully have something further to add.
I think Rick has something.
I won't comment very much on it. I think Dr. Kellett covered it fairly well. Basically, crime is going to continue because it pays so well. And what's going to happen is that the criminal organizations are going to spend great effort in laundering their money so that they're able to actually utilize it, they can bring it back to themselves, and they can benefit from their crimes. I guess the fact that the regime has been implemented, especially to the level of the FATF recommendations, has placed Canada in a position that it's a good international partner. So that it's part of the system that is making it much, much more difficult for for criminals to launder their money, move their money around the world. If Canada was not involved in the regime, then there would be huge amounts of money residing in Canada that were criminal in origin and would be affecting both the financial and the internal structures of Canada.
So you aren't prepared to make any comment as to whether 5 billion or 15 billion is a good estimate?
This has been something that we've seen for years and years and years, a desire to put a dollar figure on money laundering, and it's almost impossible. You know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know, and by that I mean you just don't know how many criminal organizations are out there.
Do we know how much we're spending roughly, totally, from the funded and unfunded government operations to chase after this money laundering that we don't know how much it is?
I'm not quite sure I understand the
The
question.
total amount we're spending now.
That would cross all sorts of lines. I
Yes.
mean, just dealing with organized crime in and of itself, and I believe I saw a figure some time back that there was 600 organized crime groups that had been identified by the RCMP in Canada.
I'm talking about this regime, and what is the cost to the public purse of this regime, the way it exists now, to chase after this money laundering and terrorist financing?
I'll turn to my colleague, Mr. Cully.
We made an estimate of that, and it's in the report. And for 2009, 2010, it was just under $86 million a year. That doesn't include, of course, what the reporting entities are spending on their part. It's just the members of the regime per se.
And you were including the non-funded entities in that as well?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very much, Senator Day. Senator Smith to be followed by Senator Harb.
Thank you, Chair. It's a fascinating discussion, and it seems like it's a moving target. And I guess it may, because I don't have obviously the knowledge that you folks would have, but is there an opportunity, because in listening to Mr. Rocho's remarks, the regime should continue, Department of Finance should create a working group, develop future issues, regime-related legislation to remove barriers to execution, optimize how partners work together, compliance with the act, inconsistencies of information, updates to accountability. I guess the question is going back to Senator Day, is that everything you do, you want to have some form of a measurement system, and you want to make sure that you have some form of a cost return or at least some understanding of what it's giving back. But could you maybe just talk a little bit about this creation of a working group? Because is there like a strategic plan? Because the criminal element, as you said, 600 identified criminal elements by the RCMP, they're obviously pretty smart, and they probably have some good consultants that they hire to try to create plans for them. What about the concept, how much strategic planning actually goes on? Because if you look at the details of the players, and these are just some of the players listed here, but there's a huge group of players in this portrait. The coordination of the players, and you've talked about that, it's working, it's progressing, but again, it's a moving target. Is there an opportunity to create a group that's really going to identify, well, if drug trade is approximately 450 billion a year, somebody said that and just blew me out of the water when I heard that number, I hope it's accurate. If that's one of the big players, then, and we know that Mexico, as an example, is a major player, and there's a lot of that drugs in the U.S. obviously is a big player, but we are becoming probably a larger player. It would indicate that there's probably, going back to the point, is it 5 or 15 billion, but is there a way that strategically we can set up more of some form of a identification of more of what crimes should we be following, and should we be putting more of that back into the RCMP's hands? Because FinTrack, of course, monitors transactions, but who should be the ones really in charge of implementing the strategy to make sure the deterrent can be maybe even getting closer to be measured, and so we can see some results? Because you talked a lot about deterrence, which I understand conceptually, but at the same time, these people are awfully smart. Are we using our minds and our ability to the best of our ability?
I think you have a wonderful question, and it's intriguing. But in terms of the mandate that we were given, it goes somewhat beyond that. And so, for that reason, the closest that we could come to deal with it was our second recommendation, where we said, no, we are aware of some of these complexities looking into the future, but we're only the outside observers. We're not the strategists. We have highlighted problems. For example, problems in the communication of information between different entities that are attributable to legislated or regulatory constraints under which they must operate. And we appreciate that these partners, when they dealt with us, pointed to their own obligations, to what they could and they could not give and divulge. And in so doing, they were doing their job. But now, we as outsiders also felt that the best people to address these issues are the ones whose problem it is.
Absolutely.
And so the second recommendation, in effect, said, now that the evaluation has been done and some of the difficulties have been identified, can you sit down together and put your heads together and see how some of these things can be fixed? And we suggested that what should come out of that would be, among other things, updates that might be required to the regime's management. And there are many conceptual possibilities that I could have maybe thought of, but did not consider it my role to suggest. But this committee, this working group, might very well come up with this. But apart from this particular case, and I have presented workshops on horizontal initiatives, and I'm currently the chair of the Worldwide Evaluation Group in Ideas addressing issues of international, of horizontal initiatives. One of the big problems is how can you, on the one hand, provide data that are protected? Can you come up with a solution that would make certain data eligible for sharing? And if so, under what conditions? But this is something that in this particular case, we could not have suggested. It's not our responsibility. But a working group can weigh the pros and the cons, and they said, well, now, given these constraints, with these changes to existing regulations, with these changes in the system, in future, we should be able to work together more effectively. And that's essentially what we were trying to communicate.
I guess, sir, if I could just, a thought that comes to mind is that there's four words that sort of rang in my head as I was listening to everyone speak and taking notes. And get the brightest and best people from the regime and partners. And to me, there's an opportunity to talk about role, mandate, scope, and measurement to fine-tune this, respecting the fact that this is a new animal that was created in the last decade, if I understand correctly, through FinTrack's creation and then the partnership with the other players. And it's an evolving body, if you'd like. It would appear that there's a great
Well,
opportunity.
I should also say that an internal Canadian interdepartmental working group is obviously the most important and the most appropriate. But this whole regime also works in the context of the international commitments to the Financial Action Task Force.
Right.
And so we're part of a larger international picture. And when we're looking for experts, I'm sure that if we look around the membership of that international body and the discussions that have been happening, coupling that with the experts that we have in Canada, that has got to be a very capable body of people to address the issues of effectiveness and efficiency and economy that have to be looked at. And obviously the complexities are such that there's no silver bullet.
Right.
Thanks.
But you do recognize and stated that not only internally, but having some international people put the brightest brains together to try to create something to move forward.
I think the fact is that the whole international community is aware of the issues and the threats that are associated with it, and it's in everyone's interest to address them. And yet, Canada and other countries have their own requirements, and so it is not that we can come up with a one-size-fits-all approach. And so for that reason, the interdepartmental working group that we suggested that should address this, to our way of thinking, is probably the best approach.
Thank you.
Senator Harb, please.
Thank you very much. Treasury Board asked you to look at a couple of things. First, the relevance of the regime, and then the effectiveness of the regime. And I'm sure we all agree that the relevance of the regime it's a given. If we don't have a FinTrack, we have to set up a FinTrack. I guess the question that I want to ask you is about the performance of the regime. And in your consultation, who of the regime partners did you meet? Can you name the people that you met or the department that you have met with?
I wish we could, but this is one of the cardinal rules that binds all evaluators. We are given a list of potentials in terms of, first of all, the regime partners, then people out there in the provinces and elsewhere. We try to draw a sample, and we collect...
Let me ask you, and I'm sorry, I just want to ask you another, differently, so you might be able to answer. There are 11 federal partners, different departments, the RCMPs, OSFIs, and so on. And I'm just interested, did you meet with all of them?
Yes.
Each one of those
Yes.
departments? That's perfect. Thank you very much. You don't need to worry about
Good.
the rest.
I was not ready to betray confidentiality.
No, not okay. You did a web survey as part of the work you have done, and you have about 256 people who have responded. Did you provide the government with the result of those surveys?
Oh, yes.
And are these surveys that possibly you could share the result with us by any chance, or they are confidential?
To some extent, I think they are already reflected in here, but I don't know whether you want to comment on that. Or?
Yeah, I think that Department of Finance would have to provide you with the specific results. everything that we've collected that can be shared has already been given
Sent
to
to
the
them.
Department of
But one would
Finance.
presume if it's a web survey, as it is, so that would have been a public that the General Joe would have gone on and gave his
No,
feedback,
it was
or
by
no?
invitation.
By
so
invitation.
the way that it operates is we are given a list of people who may have something to contribute, and then we also sent a letter out to the various different associations, bankers associations, and so on, to say, hey, you know, we're running this survey. If you have an opinion, now's your chance to get your voice heard.
Okay, and
so
then
conceivably, we had 256 opinions.
right, and so I presume that's why one of my colleagues have asked you the questions about the partners, whether or not you have met with the partners, the people who have to do the work in order to provide the information to Fintrack. And I take you to recommendation number 2B, where you have raised concern by reporting entity about reporting entity because they felt that their issues were not being addressed. And I am believing that the government have been told that what you need to do, you need to go and consult with those partners before you move ahead with the next step. Would that be correct?
Yes, we consulted with all of them, and in the process of consultation, some of these concerns appeared, and they were basically inherent in the differing mandates of these partners. In some cases, they said, well, we can go so far but no further. And so we operated within the constraints of the ability of the partners to tell their story and to tell it as fully as possible. Again, I'm wondering whether Dr. Kellett might want to add a couple of thoughts on that point.
Let me throw a couple of little questions if before you bring him on. Is that in 2C, it's in line with the same thing. If you are quite critical of the regime, you talk about the inconsistencies that identified in the regime performance data and statistic to facilitate the regime ability to accurately report on its achievement. And probably you are aware also the Auditor General have also made similar comment on that and had some serious concerns in terms of the effectiveness of the regime. The department, I suppose, or the government have issued this strengthening the consultation paper. I presume they have looked at your recommendation before they issued it. And have you had a chance to look at this? And could you give us your comment about whether or not you feel that this responds to what you are saying?
I think this was subsequent to our evaluation. We've become aware of it, but we're not in a position to offer any comparison at this stage.
Okay. Final question, Chair, with your permission. You sort of give the regime a credit here in saying that when they share information with third parties, that they ensure that there's a privacy and there's a balance between the right of the individual in terms of charter of right and so on. I want to ask you first, what evidence do you have? And the reason why I say that is that now one of the proposals in the consultation paper wanted Fintrack, wanted the banks, the financial institutions, to pass on all of the information, not 10,000 and up, but any kind of information from zero transfer electronically up to whatever, to Fintrack. Now, Fintrack have those information, and they have all kind of MOUs with other countries. Some of those countries may have privacy laws, may not have privacy laws, but because they are partners, they have the legal right or the moral right to ask Fintrack for information about any kind of transaction under $10,000. Therefore, given a situation in one of those countries, conceivably an agency could embark on a witch hunt. And I wanted to find out what sort of evidence do you have, or did you look at to ensure that, in fact, before we supply information to a third party, we ensure that they have laws that are consistent with our Canadian Charter of Right and Freedom?
Now, on this very important question, I must very definitely refer to my associates who looked at some of the details. And perhaps Dr. Kellett recalls some of those aspects.
Maybe you can comment on the other points that we raised.
Yes, certainly. One of the issue with FinTrack is really not that they're too willing to give information away or to provide details, even of without a name or the name of a suspected organization. Their problem has always been for those receiving the information, the RCMP and CBSA and so on, that the information was never specific enough, not enough detail for them to pursue an investigation. Because the Act itself, that you've been looking at, you know that there are fairly rigid constraints on FinTrack in terms of how they protect the information that they collect, even when they do a strategic analysis, how much of that can they reveal without compromising privacy of even an organization. And so this was one of the complaints, in fact, of the banks and so on, those providing the data up the line, is that they weren't getting a lot of information back about how strategically to look for a suspicious transaction. Or, are there some individuals or regions where we need to pay more attention? Well, FinTrack is bound by the Act not to divulge that kind of information within Canada and certainly without. There is nothing, no organization outside, no organization within the United States, Homeland Security, for example, can demand of FinTrack particular information. FinTrack is not obliged to give it to them under any of the agreements with the FATF. But you should really be asking FinTrack about those restrictions, because they are the ones that are holding all the data they get and protecting it against compromise. And we had no need to look at any of that, because, of course, that we weren't trying to say, are they doing a good job in terms of protecting the information? Their track record since 2001 says that they have been, and nothing has been, as far as we were ever alerted to, compromised or in any way divulged that shouldn't have been. As I said, it really seems to be the other way around. So the question of lowering the threshold, as far as the reporting agency is concerned, we mentioned this earlier on an hour ago. So is that going to be a greater burden to them than it currently is? There are issues, by the way, in their number B that they felt they were not being heard about. I don't think there were many of them. And of course, because our job was at the macro level, we only rolled those up and provided them to the Department of Finance to be considered. The greater issue for them was getting information back down the system from FinTrack in terms of strategic and tactical information. They felt they were giving information into a vacuum and getting nothing back. They were looking for more guidance on how to identify suspicious transactions, to keep an audit trail of that, and so on. That's the kind of thing I think that they were asking about. But remember, there were a lot of different views expressed through the focus groups in particular, and Mr. Laurendeau was one of those focus group facilitators, and he may have a comment about some of the observations that came from that are generic and can be shared with you.
Well, I can say that there were lots of different views expressed through the focus groups, because there were very different players, and not everybody felt totally comfortable with the requirements of the Act. At the same time, as has been indicated, people feel that they provide lots of information at some cost to them, and that they would like to get a lot more feedback on the value of that information. But to answer your question, I don't think that anybody has expressed at any time real concern about the protection of personal information, and that the system was threatening that aspect of the procedures in any way, shape, or form at the moment.
Thank you very much, Senator Harb. That completes round one of our questions. I have one question in round two. Senator Ringuette.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Reynolds, I'm a country girl from New Brunswick, and probably extremely naive in regards to money laundering and all kinds of schemes. And when you gave us an example of how it can be done in a life insurance scheme, and all of a sudden I said, "Well, okay." Then you added to that in Canada there are banks or bankers that could be part of or could participate, I think, in different schemes. To satisfy my curiosity, and maybe you can't, but could you give us an example similar to the one you gave us in the life insurance industry of how money laundering can occur in Canada with banks?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to be clear, I didn't say specifically a bank.
No, okay.
Okay. And banks fit into money laundering because they're an integral part of our financial system. And they are the ones that have the ability to move money internationally, to move money across the country. If you want to move money throughout the world, and you can have it in 6 countries in a few hours, and you just have to work at it a little bit. Okay? The big thing with money laundering, it's a mechanism basically to move and disguise money. Right? So the more times that you can break the money trail, tracking back to actually the source of the criminality, right, of where the funds came from, right, is much, much better. So if you only break the trail back once, it's fairly easy to find where it came from. But if you break it 20 times, it's much, much better. And by that I mean breaking it, for example, depositing it into a bank, taking it out and physically walking across the street, putting it into another bank, or transporting it across the border because jurisdictional issues cause problems for investigations, especially into areas that have weak banking or weak money laundering laws. So the more that you move the money around, the more that you cut the trail, the more that you use the money laundering mechanisms, right, the more difficult it is to follow that trail. Okay? And really it's all about, for the criminal, the possession and use of those funds, because they worked hard in their criminal life to be able to receive those. So as far as the banks are concerned, the banks are a conduit because they are a legitimate conduit for commerce, for money to move. They represent our financial system, and they can be used in any number of ways in correspondent banking relationships.
But could it be like I'm intrigued by this $10,000 threshold? Like if serious criminal organization wants to break the trail, as you indicate, as many times as possible to remove the traceability, would they go lower than $10,000?
They do on a regular basis, and it's called structuring, so that they can structure their transactions under the reportable limits. Okay? So you would have $9,999.99, for example, or less, going in a transaction. My understanding is the from a brief read was that the proposal is only for international electronic fund transfers,
Yeah.
to reduce it to 0. Okay. Very significant from the terrorist financing side, because terrorist financing is smaller dollars. And traditionally, or in the past, what has been found is the money that moves is much smaller than what moves for criminal activity.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
sense would be a suspicious transaction, I would think.
I would hope so, sir.
And it will be reported.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Ringett. Because of the interest that's being generated, I have Senator Maltais that has a question he would like to ask.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reynolds? You said something that I found intriguing. You said that someone can deposit a certain amount of money in a bank and then cross the street and then redeposit the same amount, approximately. For an ordinary citizen of Canada, opening up a bank account does require a certain amount of time, certain number of minutes of identification and so forth. If the person crosses the street and opens up an account in another bank and does it 3 times in the same day, is there not someone who will realize that there's something suspicious? Because normally it's enough to have one bank, I imagine, that people involved in money laundering may have certain tricks. At the end of the day, banks are maybe likely to consult each other and realize that so-and-so has opened up 3 bank accounts. I'm rather perplexed at this.
To answer the question is the banking association themselves, but it's been my experience that the banks, and when I talk about going from one bank to another, I'm talking about, for example, moving from the CIBC to the TD Bank, they don't generally share their customer list because they are competitors. And so they're not comparing, they do not have databases that come together to say that you possess an account with their particular branch. They're happy to have you there as long as you're not conducting some questionable activity.
Mais encore là,
But once again, if you're a small business person making a deposit, either you have cash to deposit, but an individual doesn't walk around with $1,500, $2,000 every day. The bank is likely to ask where the money comes from. If you're a wage earner, in the case of the owner of a small business, it's normal for people to deposit certain amounts, but an individual citizen, it strikes me as rather bizarre. In the bank structure, is there not someone who is likely to become a bit suspicious of this at one point?
Would become suspicious of this. In fact, there is a methodology known as smurfing, where individuals are employed by criminals to, usually individuals that don't have a criminal record, that are not directly associated to the criminal activity, who are involved in actually placing the money into the financial system. And they will do exactly as you said, show up with $1,500. And they will have multiple accounts. So it does actually happen.
merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. We've covered so very many interesting issues today. One issue that was raised last week by witnesses from the financial sector that I would like to have you just touch on, if you might, and that is that they supported a risk-based approach rather than a rules-based approach to reporting of suspicious transactions. Do you have any observations on that?
We do not have observations that relate directly to the banking sector or so, but the concept of being selective in terms of risk is something that is very much part of government policy. And the government realizes there are only so many things you can do before you reach the point of diminishing returns. And so in terms of evaluations, which is our area, Treasury Board advocates in the formulation of evaluation plans, don't evaluate everything, go after the most important risk-driven aspects, and the departments have to do that in fact. Now, my perception is that similar considerations would apply in the private sector, and elsewhere. But again, I would like to ask my colleagues whether you're aware of anything more beyond this. I see Ralph shaking his head.
Way. Thank you very much for that response. Gentlemen, I know I speak on behalf of all of the members of the committee in expressing our appreciation to your appearing before us today. You have been an outstanding panel, and we thank you. This meeting is terminated.